How does a peaceful scholar become a revolutionary commander? How do you go from teaching under a tree to toppling kingdoms? That's what we're exploring today. So, how does it happen? How does a man who spent his 30s and 40s as a traveling teacher, a quiet scholar writing poetry and religious commentary, end up leading the military and spiritual conquest of an entire region? To understand that, you have to walk with him into the heart of Hausa land in the 1790s. Picture the scene. It's a dry, hot season. Usman Fodio, dressed in simple robes, likely riding a donkey, arrives at a village on the outskirts of one of the Hausa states, maybe Gobir, maybe Kebi. He's welcomed not as a conqueror, but as a respected mullam, a teacher. He's Fulani, yes, but the Fulani here aren't just nomadic herders. Many, like his family, are settled, urban, deeply learned in Islamic law and theology. He sits under a tree or in a modest mosque. The villagers gather, and he doesn't start with politics. He starts with faith, with purity. His message, which we know from his own writings, especially his early work, Bayan Wujub al-Hijra, was focused on Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God. He argued that the Hausa rulers and their religious elites had corrupted Islam. They mixed it with pre-Islamic animist practices. They imposed illegal taxes on the poor. Their courts were unjust. They wore silk and gold while the peasants struggled. He was calling for a return to the prophetic model, a just society governed by clear Islamic law. And this message was electric. It resonated with three groups who were all, for different reasons, fed up. First, the rural Fulani communities, who often felt marginalized and exploited by the urban Hausa aristocracy. Second, the lower-class Hausa commoners, the Talakawa, who bore the brunt of heavy taxation and corruption. And third, a whole class of devout Muslim scholars and merchants who saw the ruling elite as impious and illegitimate. For years, this was the jihad of the pen. Fodio wrote letters to the rulers, advising them to reform. He preached publicly, gathering a community of followers called the Jama'ah, the community. His son, Muhammad Bello, and his brother, Abdullahi, were his chief lieutenants, spreading the message. They built a parallel society, autonomous towns where they could live under their interpretation of Sharia. This was a direct challenge to the state's authority. You can't have a kingdom where a growing chunk of the population says, "We don't recognize your laws, only God's." The ruler of Gobir, Sultan Yunfa, watched this with increasing alarm. At first, he tried to co-opt Fodio. He even studied under him for a time. But the gap was unbridgeable. Fodio's movement was a fundamental threat to Yunfa's power and the entire economic system of the Hausa states. Tensions escalated. There were skirmishes. Followers of Fodio were harassed. Then, in 1804, the tipping point. Sultan Yunfa summoned Fodio to his capital, Al-Kalawa. It was a trap, an assassination attempt. Fodio's followers got wind of it, and a confrontation erupted. Fodio narrowly escaped. This was the moment of no return. The peaceful phase was over. In a deliberate echo of the Prophet Muhammad's flight from Mecca, Fodio and his entire community performed a hijra, a migration. They left their homes in Gobir and moved west to a place called Gudu. It was a symbolic and strategic declaration. We are leaving the land of corruption. At Gudu, the community took an oath of allegiance to him, declaring him the Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful. The green flag of the jihad was raised, and for the first time the call went out not just for spiritual renewal, but for armed struggle, a defensive jihad to protect the community and establish a just order. Now, the word jihad here is critical. This wasn't a vague, holy war. In Islamic political thought, a jihad of the sword is justified primarily for defense or to remove an oppressive ruler who prevents Muslims from practicing their faith. Don Fodio and his scholars wrote volumes justifying this. They weren't conquering to convert by force, though conversion accelerated afterwards. They were conquering to replace what they saw as tyrannical, illegitimate governments. And once the war started, it was shockingly fast. Why? Because the old Hausa Kingdoms were hollowed out from within. When Don Fodio's forces, led by his brother Abdallah and other commanders, marched on a city, they often found the gates opened from the inside. Dissatisfied commoners, sympathetic scholars, and rival factions saw the jihadists as liberators. The key battle was at Toppled in 1804, just months after the Hijra. A Gobir army tried to crush the fledgling community. Against the odds, Don Fodio's forces won. That victory was a signal. It proved God was on their side, and it proved they could fight. One by one, the Hausa states fell: Gobir, Kebbi, Zamfara. Then the major centers. Kano fell in 1807, Katsina in 1807. By 1808, the old order was shattered. The final symbolic victory was the capture of Al-Kalawa, Yunfa's capital, in 1808. Yunfa was killed in the fighting. But then came the real test. You've won the war. Now what? In 1809, Don Fodio founded a new capital, Sokoto. The name means market in the Hausa language, signaling its purpose as a hub. And here, the scholar once again stepped forward. The warrior phase was largely over for him. He returned to writing, to teaching, to being the spiritual compass. The practical, brutal, administrative work of building an empire? He delegated that to two men, his brother, Abdallah, who became the emir of Gwandu and oversaw the Western Emirates, and his son, Muhammad Bello, who governed from Sokoto and was clearly the heir. In 1812, Don Fodio made it official. He divided the vast territories into two great administrative blocks. The Eastern Emirates, under Bello's influence, centered on Sokoto, and the Western Emirates, under Abdallah, centered on Gwandu. This was the birth of the federated structure that would define the Caliphate. Then, in 1817, Usman Don Fodio died. He was buried in a simple grave in Sokoto, a man who had lived to see his revolutionary idea become a sprawling, messy, powerful reality. But his death left a monumental question hanging over the empire. He was the charismatic founder, the undisputed spiritual authority. He held the whole revolutionary project together by the force of his personality and piety. Now, the project was in the hands of administrators, of institution builders. Could this revolutionary state, born from fiery sermons and cavalry charges, be turned into a lasting government? Could you bureaucratize a jihad? That's the immense challenge facing the brilliant, pragmatic, and sometimes ruthless Muhammad Bello. And what he built in the decades after his father's death wasn't just a kingdom, it was one of the most sophisticated administrative machines in 19th century Africa. We're talking about a postal system, a standing army with specialized units, a centralized treasury, a slave plantation economy on an industrial scale, and a legal bureaucracy that processed thousands of cases. That's the transition from revolution to state. And that's where we're going in part 3.